Shockingly, a single question has just shattered the carefully polished narrative of Washington's most powerful committee, leaving a room full of legal experts in a state of paralyzed silence. You might think you know how congressional hearings work, with their scripted outrage and predictable sound bites, but what happened when Mike Johnson leaned toward the microphone was something entirely different. For months, the public has been fed a specific version of history, but a secret truth was hidden in the gaps between what was said and what was intentionally buried. Within just the next 2 minutes, you will see exactly how a simple inquiry can dismantle an entire political machine, revealing a reality that certain organizations have spent millions to keep under wraps. The atmosphere in the hearing room was thick with anticipation, yet nobody truly expected fireworks. The air was heavy, quiet, and punctuated only by the low hum of cameras and electronic equipment. Jamie Raskin, a seasoned veteran and scholar of constitutional law, sat back in his chair with his hands folded, a calm expression masking his readiness for the usual partisan barbs. He had heard every version of this routine before, accusations dressed up as questions, and he seemed entirely unshakable. On the other side, Mike Johnson remained unnervingly still. He wasn't there to shout. He was there to conduct a surgical strike on the very foundation of the proceedings. "Congressman Raskin," Johnson began, his voice calm but intensely focused. "You've spent most of your professional life teaching constitutional law. Is that fair?" Raskin nodded, acknowledging his expertise in due process and minority rights. The room quieted as Johnson paused, creating a void that demanded to be filled. Then came the question that shifted the entire energy of the chamber. Did the January 6th committee follow the Constitution? Raskin's confidence seemed to flicker for a split second. He adjusted his glasses and took a slight, sharp inhale. Instead of a direct answer, he began to speak of national trauma and unprecedented assaults. But Johnson didn't let him retreat into moral framing. He pushed past the meaning well and the feeling justified to demand a verdict on strict adherence to the law. As the tension locked in, the audience realized this wasn't just another debate. It was an exposure of power hiding behind ambiguity. The most devastating part wasn't the words exchanged, but the silence that followed when there was nowhere left to hide. "This will be brief," Mike Johnson said, leaning toward the microphone. "Procedure over passion." The committee on trial. The heavy silence in the room was a living thing, an invisible wall that Mike Johnson had just built with a single, devastating question. As Jamie Raskin sat motionless, the focus shifted from the abstract drama of the hearing to the cold, hard mechanics of the January 6th committee's operation. This wasn't just a political disagreement anymore, it was a systematic interrogation of how power had been wielded. Johnson leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping on a thick legal folder before he flipped it open. His movements were methodical, like a surgeon preparing for a delicate but necessary incision. Across from him, Raskin's expression remained calm, but there was a new tension in the way he held himself. Behind them both, aides were scribbling furiously, the scratching of pens against paper the only sound other than Johnson's steady, prosecutorial tone. "Let's talk specifics, Congressman," Johnson said, his eyes scanning a document. "You've spent your career championing due process. You've written extensively about the importance of protecting minority rights from the overreach of a majority. Is that still your position?" Raskin nodded slowly. "Of course." "Then help me understand the committee's formation," Johnson countered instantly. "Is it fair to say the minority party was denied the right to seat its chosen members? Usually, in a bipartisan investigation, both sides pick their own representatives to ensure a balanced perspective. Why was that tradition abandoned here?" Raskin straightened his tie, his jaw tightening. The circumstances were unprecedented. "We were dealing with a national trauma, an emergency that threatened the very transfer of power. The Speaker made a determination that some individuals were too close to the event to serve impartially. So, the answer is yes." The minority was blocked, Johnson said, checking a box on his page. "Now, let's look at the subpoenas. Your committee compelled testimony from hundreds of citizens. In a standard criminal trial or a fair congressional inquiry, those individuals would have the right to cross-examination. They would be able to challenge the evidence presented against them. Did your committee allow for cross-examination?" Raskin inhaled sharply, his tone beginning to bristle. "This was not a criminal trial, Congressman Johnson. This was an investigation by a select committee with the authority to protect the Republic. We followed the procedures we deemed appropriate for the magnitude of the moment." "Magnitude of the moment," Johnson repeated, the words hanging in the air. "It's a powerful phrase. But does the magnitude of a moment suspend the Fifth Amendment? Does it negate the right to counsel? Because based on the records, witnesses were frequently denied the counsel of their choice or faced severe limitations on what their lawyers could do. Is that how fairness works, or is that how a television studio works?" The comparison hit like a physical blow. The room felt smaller as the accusation of partisan theater took center stage. Raskin's voice sharpened, defensiveness creeping in. "The Constitution is not a suicide pact. We had a responsibility to inform the American people of the danger they faced." "Agreed," Johnson replied, his voice still unnervingly calm. "The Constitution is not a suicide pact, but it is a set of rules. And if you believe that a just cause gives you the authority to ignore those rules, then the Constitution becomes optional. You are essentially telling the country that process only matters when the outcome is convenient. If a future Congress uses this exact same model, excluding your allies, denying them the right to cross-examine evidence, and limiting their legal representation, would you still call that defending democracy?" The question was a trap, and both men knew it. Raskin hesitated, his jaw set in a hard line. He tried to pivot back to the existential threat of the day, but Johnson kept pinning him down to the procedural reality. The conflict was no longer about what happened on the streets. It was about what happened in the committee rooms. Johnson pointed out that the committee's mandate was to follow the facts, yet it seemed to follow a predetermined script. He questioned why exculpatory materials, evidence that might contradict the committee's narrative, were seemingly disclosed only to the public in highly edited segments rather than to the subjects of the investigation as required by basic standards of justice. "You taught your students that the law is there to restrain power precisely when that power feels most justified," Johnson said softly, looking directly at Raskin. "When you define justice by the outcome you want rather than the process you follow, you aren't enforcing the law, you are curating it." Raskin remained silent, his eyes fixed on the desk in front of him. The prosecutorial weight of the exchange had transformed the hearing into a trial of the committee itself. The air remained charged, the audience leaning in, sensing that the debate over legal technicalities was about to unveil something even more controversial. While these technicalities were being debated, the real bombshell lay in what the public was allowed to see and what was hidden in the cutting room. The art of the edit. Curating the narrative. While the debate over legal technicalities and subpoenas had already strained the atmosphere, Mike Johnson was preparing to shift the focus toward the most tangible evidence of the investigation: the video footage. This transition from the abstract rule of law to the visual reality of the events marked a turning point in the hearing, where the focus moved from what was said to what was shown and, more importantly, what was intentionally omitted. Johnson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward the primary video monitor in the room. He didn't just look at his notes. He looked at Jamie Raskin with the steady gaze of someone about to reveal a long-held secret. "You've spoken extensively about transparency, Congressman," Johnson began, his voice dropping into a lower, more serious register. "But there is a significant difference between releasing footage and curating a narrative. My question is about the months of editing that occurred before the public saw a single second of those primetime broadcasts." Raskin straightened his tie, the calm he had maintained throughout the morning starting to fray at the edges. "We engaged in responsible presentation," Raskin countered. The American people deserved to see the events of that day in a way that was clear and comprehensible. "Responsible presentation," Johnson repeated, tapping his pen against the desk with rhythmic emphasis. "Is it responsible to cut timestamps? We have found evidence where footage recorded minutes apart was aired as if it happened in mere seconds. That isn't condensation for the sake of time. That is manipulation for the sake of persuasion." The murmur that rippled through the chamber was audible now. The tension was no longer just between two men. It had spread to the audience and the gallery. Raskin's voice rose, defensiveness coloring his words. "We were working to prevent misinformation. The public needed to understand the threat to our democracy without being confused by thousands of hours of irrelevant static." "Irrelevant static?" Johnson's eyebrows shot up. "Let's talk about what you considered irrelevant. Why did the committee choose to withhold footage showing Capitol Police officers actually opening doors for protesters? Why was that specific exculpatory evidence buried while scripted, primetime clips were played on a loop?" Raskin hesitated. For the first time, the seasoned constitutional scholar seemed to be searching for a footing that wasn't there. "Some footage could have been misinterpreted," he said cautiously. "By creating misinformation to prevent it?" Johnson fired back. "That is the definition of propaganda, not investigation. You took the truth and you curated it. You chose what served your narrative and you discarded what complicated it. You told the public they had seen everything, when in reality they had only seen what you permitted them to judge." The debate had now reached a fever pitch. Johnson was acting like a prosecutor, revealing a hidden tape that changed the entire context of a crime. He pointed out that true transparency would have meant releasing the full sequences, not the carefully scripted highlights that dominated the news cycle for months. Imagine a movie where you only see the villain striking, but never the provocation that is the power of the edit. Johnson highlighted the fact that it took a change in leadership to finally begin the process of releasing tens of thousands of hours of security footage that had been kept under lock and key by the committee. Why keep it hidden if it confirms the story? If you're not questioning why 40,000 hours of tape were restricted, you're missing the biggest part of the puzzle. This is exactly why you need to stay tuned, because what we are uncovering here is a masterclass in narrative control. When a committee decides what the public is allowed to know, oversight becomes authorship, Johnson said, his voice echoing in the quiet chamber. And authors don't like footnotes. They don't like contradictions. You didn't just edit video. You edited the historical record. Raskin bristled at the word propaganda, but the physical evidence was difficult to ignore. The revelation that timestamps were removed, the very heartbeat of any security footage, suggested a level of intentionality that went far beyond clarity. It suggested a production designed for prime time consumption. Think about that for a second. If the footage was so damning, why did it need a Hollywood-style edit to make its point? If you find yourself nodding along to every scripted clip, you might be the target of the very misinformation Raskin claims to be fighting. The public saw what you chose, Johnson concluded, leaning back but keeping his eyes locked on Raskin. When evidence helped your narrative, it was prime time. When it complicated it, it was buried in a vault. The room was silent. The weight of the accusation of curated truth hanging over the dais. This is a wake-up call for anyone who values the actual facts over a polished story. Don't let others decide what is relevant for you to see. Go look at the raw footage now available, compare it to the clips you were shown. If you value the truth, hit that like button and share this with someone who still thinks they saw the whole truth. We cannot afford to let the historical record be written by an editor's blade. The debate over footage had exposed a deeper rift. The committee wasn't just selective about video, but about which violence it chose to care about, leading directly into a confrontation over the very standards of justice themselves. Johnson closed the file on the video evidence and leaned in closer for a more personal strike, ready to challenge the ideological consistency of the entire investigation. What happens when the rules you teach in a seminar room vanish the moment you hold the gavel? Stick around, because the answer Johnson forces out next is something you simply won't believe. Asymmetry of justice, ideology versus rules. As the personal stories collided with procedural rules, the conversation moved toward the hidden records that still remain under lock and key. Mike Johnson shifted his gaze from the video monitor, his posture straight and his expression unyielding. He was no longer just questioning the footage. He was challenging the very definition of justice that the committee had operated under for years. "Let's address the standard you've set here, Jamie," Johnson said, his voice carrying a weight that filled the room. "You've described January 6th as an existential threat to the Republic, a unique, once-in-a-generation trauma. And yet, during that same period, we saw federal courthouses across this country under literal siege. We saw months of riots that resulted in burned buildings and dozens of deaths. Why were those events deemed an expression of frustration while this was an insurrection?" Raskin scoffed, a quick, sharp sound that conveyed immediate dismissal. "The comparison is absurd. January 6th was an attempt to overturn a peaceful transfer of power. Our mandate was narrow because the threat was singular. You are trying to equate lawful protest with a violent coup attempt." "I'm comparing standards," Johnson countered. His tone remains calm but sharp. "Does the Constitution weigh motive differently based on ideology? Because it seems to me that when the cause is one you sympathize with, the violence is contextualized. But when it's your political opponents, the procedure is abandoned in the name of urgency. That is the definition of asymmetry." The heavy atmosphere in the room tightened as the two men locked eyes. It was a rapid-fire exchange about whether justice is an outcome you desire or a process you must follow. Johnson pushed harder, pointing to the lack of subpoenas for anyone outside the Republican circle. "Did you refer a single Democrat to the Justice Department? Did you even investigate whether there was non-Republican conduct that contributed to the chaos?" Raskin leaned into his microphone, his frustration visible. "This is partisan theater. The facts led us where they led us. We defended democracy by investigating the people who attacked it. By deciding who deserved its protections, Johnson shot back. You taught your students that equal protection isn't conditional. Yet your committee operated as if some Americans forfeited their rights because of their political affiliation. If a cause is just, do the rules become optional? If you deny one side due process because you believe they are wrong, you haven't saved democracy. Bypassing the law is how you normalize its destruction." Raskin's jaw tightened. He shifted in his seat, his hands gesturing toward his chest. "This is personal for me. My family lived this. We buried a son. We endured threats. We didn't approach this casually or with asymmetry in mind. We approached it with reality." "I am not questioning your pain," Johnson said, his voice dropping to a somber, quieter level. "But pain explains motive. It doesn't replace rules. Moral certainty is a powerful thing, Jamie, but it can also corrupt judgment. You cannot use personal tragedy as immunity from procedural scrutiny. You taught that the Constitution restrains power precisely when that power feels most justified. So, I ask you, if a future Congress uses your model against your allies, denying them counsel, withholding evidence, and curating the record, would you defend it then?" Raskin didn't answer. He stared straight ahead, the silence speaking louder than any rebuttal could. Johnson let the moment hang, allowing everyone in the room to feel the weight of the precedent that had been set. If justice is only for the righteous, then it isn't constitutional power anymore. It's just raw, unconstrained power. When you define justice as outcomes rather than process, Johnson concluded, you don't enforce the law, you curate it. He leaned back, the prosecutorial fire in his eyes dimming into a cold, analytical observation. This wasn't about accountability. It was about permission. And once permission to skip the rules is granted, the precedent doesn't care who holds power next. It's a tool that will eventually find a new hand. The room grew smaller as Johnson brought up the sealed transcripts, hinting at secrets yet to be uncovered. If the record was as complete as Raskin claimed, why were thousands of pages still hidden from the public eye? The silence settled again, thick and heavy. Every time Johnson asked for a yes or no, he was met with a sermon, and the audience was beginning to realize that the most important information was still hidden in the vault. Truth doesn't care about timing, but power certainly does. This is the moment where we have to ask ourselves, do we want a system where the rules change based on who is in the hot seat? If you believe the law should be a shield for everyone, not just a sword for the powerful, then you need to see what else was hidden in those transcripts. Hit that like button and share this if you think the full record should be public. Don't let the narrative be curated, for you demand the facts. The room was quiet as Johnson slowly closed his folder, prepared for the final blow. The absence of an answer was becoming the most telling part of the day. The sealed transcripts and the future precedent. While the debate over ideology had already left the room in a state of exhaustion, Mike Johnson was not yet finished. He slowly closed the file on personal motives and reached for a thinner, more clinical-looking folder. The room grew smaller as he brought up the sealed transcripts, hinting at secrets yet to be uncovered. This wasn't just about what was said on camera anymore. It was about the thousands of pages of testimony that the public was never supposed to read. "Truth doesn't care about timing, Jamie," Johnson said, a faint, almost pitying smile touching his lips. "But it seems your committee cared a great deal about it. You told the public they had seen everything relevant. Yet, we are finding thousands of hours of footage and hundreds of pages of transcripts that were sealed. Why the secrecy? If the goal was transparency, why wait for a change in leadership to let the light in?" Raskin straightened his posture, his defense acting as a cracking shield. "We followed standard practice. We protected the public from confusion by focusing on the most corroborated and relevant facts. Some testimony was simply unreliable." Johnson leaned in, that faint smile turning into a sharp clinical observation. "By what standard? Corroborated by whom? The same committee that controlled the edits? That is a circular process, not an investigation. You claim to have protected the public from confusion, but in reality, you protected them from complexity. You presented a story with no footnotes, no contradictions, and no dissenting voices. When a committee decides what the public is allowed to know, oversight becomes authorship. And authors, as we know, do not like it when the reader finds the deleted scenes. The atmosphere shifted from a policy debate to a prosecutorial dismantling of the committee's very foundation. Johnson pointed out that the delay in releasing the full record wasn't a logistical issue, it was a tactical one. "You curated a prime-time experience," Johnson continued. "But real justice happens in the messy, unedited details. By sealing these transcripts, you didn't just hide unreliable testimony. You hid the counter-arguments that might have ruined your script. This is the point where you, the viewer, need to ask yourself, if the evidence was so overwhelming, why did it need to be protected from public scrutiny for years? What was in those transcripts that required a change in House leadership to finally see the light of day?" The dialogue then moved into a dangerous trap. Johnson leaned forward, his voice dropping into an ominous tone. "Let's look at the future precedent you've set. If a Republican committee operated exactly the way yours did, excluding your allies, sealing transcripts that complicate their narrative, and denying cross-examination, would you defend that process? Would you stand by and say the emergency justified the shortcuts?" Raskin's laughter was sharp, brittle, and dismissive. "That is a hypothetical comparison that ignores the unique threat we faced. Circumstances matter." "That is what every exception sounds like," Johnson replied, his eyes locked on Raskin's. You taught your students that the Constitution exists precisely to restrain people who are convinced they are right. Your confidence that you were right is actually the warning sign. By normalizing this danger, you have built a blueprint that will eventually be used against your own allies. You didn't just investigate an event, you created a model where process bends for the cause of survival. But survival arguments never end, Jamie. They just find new authors. This is the chilling reality of modern oversight. When the rules are treated as obstacles to be bypassed, the system itself begins to erode. We are currently witnessing the fallout of a process that prioritized the outcome over the integrity of the record. This isn't just a political debate, it is a warning for every citizen. If we allow one side to hide evidence under the guise of protection, we lose the ability to judge fairly. Think about the power dynamic here. They decide what you get to see, then they tell you that you've seen enough to judge. That isn't transparency, that's authorship. You need to act on this information. Don't let a curated truth be the only thing you know about your own government. If you believe that transparency should be absolute and that the law shouldn't have narratives, then you need to see the documents that are finally being unsealed. Go to the public repository, read the unedited transcripts, and compare them to what you were told. Hit that like button and subscribe right now to stay updated as we break down these hidden records page by page. If you miss this, you're letting them win the narrative war. Comment facts over fiction below if you demand the full, unsealed record. The final moments of the hearing were not marked by a closing statement, but by a chilling realization that the silence was the final answer. Johnson slowly closed his folder, the sound echoing in the silent room as he prepared for the final blow. The question had been answered not with words, but with a refusal that spoke volumes. The absence of an answer is itself an answer. The absence of an answer. The silence in the hearing room had become agonizing, lasting far longer than any previous exchange. It was no longer a void. It was a physical weight that pressed down on every person present. Mike Johnson did not move. He stood behind the microphone, his eyes locked on Jamie Raskin with a steady, clinical patience. The only sound was the faint, electronic hum of the overhead lights and the distant rustle of papers near the back of the chamber. Lawyers for both sides sat motionless, offering no objections, no interruptions, and no lifelines. Johnson waited until the tension reached its absolute breaking point before repeating the question one last time, slower and more deliberate than before. "Did you follow the Constitution?" Jamie Raskin stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his expression an unreadable mask of exhaustion and refusal. Seconds ticked away like hours on the historical record. Finally, breaking the stillness, Raskin spoke, but not to answer. "This hearing has run its course," he said, his voice flat. Johnson nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "So has the evasion," he replied quietly. He didn't need to shout. The refusal was the loudest thing in the room. Johnson slowly leaned back and closed his leather folder. The sound of the cover meeting the desk echoed through the quiet chamber like a gavel strike, though no gavel was needed. The verdict had been delivered not by a vote, but by the absence of a yes. By refusing to confirm a binary compliance with the supreme law of the land, the committee had essentially admitted that they viewed the Constitution as a tool for their cause rather than a rule for their power. It was an admission that necessity had superseded the law. As the hearing concluded, the legacy of the exchange became clear. Clarity had finally been achieved through refusal. The lesson for everyone watching was somber. Every abuse of power in history begins with the belief that the cause is so righteous that the rules no longer apply. When the Constitution is treated as optional for those who believe they are right, it ceases to be a safeguard and becomes a mere suggestion. Mike Johnson walked away from the dais, leaving behind a folder that held more than just transcripts. It held the record of an abandoned standard. We are left to contemplate what kind of country follows when the law is treated as a narrative to be curated rather than a boundary to be respected. The question had won, and the silence that followed was the only answer the record would ever receive.